Today we're going to be looking at the progressive movement and the changes that happened in a lot of urban environments in the early 20th century, late 19th century. Last time we were together, we looked at really the rural area and the populist movement that began there and the attempts to improve the lives of people and the work of people in those environments. But today, sort of looking again at the progressive era, we're looking at changes that happen for industrial folks, right? There's changes that have to happen, right? Government is becoming far too corrupt. In the late 1800s is a period where a lot of corrupt governments exist. We know that there are farmer problems, but there's also immigration issues. And there's a large number of people who are coming from Europe and Southern Europe and Asia, particularly places like China and Japan, and going into the West Coast. And those are different issues that are emerging. There are urban situations that is overcrowding. And again, there are these immigrant groups that are coming in and nativist feelings that are arising because of that. Women's rights comes in, but the progressive movement really sort of takes its peak, let's say, with the rise of progressive presidents in the early 1900s. So by the late 19th century and the early 1900s, government has become extremely corrupt. You have in the Senate, it's called the Millionaires Club, where special interest groups are really just funneling outright bribes to politicians to try and get policies passed, and use these connections and this money to really bolster their own political gains. This is sort of highlighted with the spoil system. The spoil system is where a friend may be a political leader, right? So if your friend becomes the mayor or even just sort of a local administrator, then you can use his connections to gain a post within the government. And this is sort of comes from the say, to the victor goes the spoils, right? And this idea that you can use your political influence to put people into power so that you can then continue your political influence. And a growing federal government that grows through the 19th century helps to encourage that, right? As more and more people are employed by, the government, there is this sort of ability to, get more people jobs within the different levels of administration. In terms of the spoil system, there's also a big change that occurs in the end of the 19th century. This is particularly true when President William McKinley is assassinated by Leon Kolzga, who was looking to get a job within the government, and he then assassinates, because he doesn't get the job, he assassinates the president with whom he is disgruntled. And this then creates a situation where a president has been assassinated because of this feeling of sort of deserving by certain groups of people. Along with this sort of corrupt political actions, there are what are called machine politics, where these bosses, as they were called, really operated out of a city government or out of a local government. This didn't really necessarily get to the higher reaches of, let's say, the federal government, but it was a way for the government to really extract a lot of wealth. For the local government to use the wealth of the towns, of the cities, to really get their own agendas passed, right? So in New York City, we had William Boss Tweed, and Boss Tweed was basically using his political influence and his money to basically flush the city government with his own political allies. So he would use the money. He would use the money to basically rent out bars during political during political seasons and basically get people drunk so that they would then vote for him. And basically on the night before the election, get them drunk and then just walk them to the polling station. And along with this, there would also be ways to sort of hold this political influence over, obviously, his allies and the people he wanted to hinder as well. These all sort of, you obviously can see that this is going to lead to political scandal, and there's just a ton of political scandal that riles the end of the 1800s underneath President Ulysses S. Grant. So Ulysses S. Grant was a pretty good president in terms of what he intended to do, but he sort of surrounded himself by or with really corrupt folks. And you have other examples as well. All of this leads to the Pendleton Act. The Pendleton Act begins a way of trying to get rid of the spoils system. And the Pendleton Act gives the ability for there to be a civil service exam to ensure that there is a more meritocratic opportunity for people to gain their roles in the government. It is not based on political spoils. It is not based on political connections. It is not based on friendships. It's based on the way somebody completes their exams. So within the government in the late 19th century, there's a lot of corruption. There is a lot of using political power to exert authority over others, and as a result of that, there's a call for change. Within urban environments, there's also another problem going on. There's a huge amount of people moving into cities, and these cities, immigrants are moving into the cities, and people from rural areas are moving into cities. So as a result of that, there's a growth of what are called settlement houses. Settlement houses are a way to help the urban poor and the people who are really struggling to find their sort of way in the new urban environments. This also, in a lot of ways, sort of tries to do an Americanization of people, right? They would be taught sort of different things. This also ties with second wave feminism. So first wave feminism arose in the mid 19th century, and as the second wave feminism sort of begins, the second women's right movement begins in the late 19th century, culminating with the women's right to vote in 1920. There is a growth of political activism in the settlement movement. So you have probably the most famous is Hull House in Chicago, established by Jane Addams, but there are others as well. Henry Street here in New York City is still around today, pretty famous still today, and they taught different types of classes for folks. For immigrants who moved into the cities, they were the sort of poor labor that the cities would be built on. You would have Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants in the East Coast in particular, but in the West Coast you'd have Chinese immigrants who would really be doing so much of the work as urban environments are building new buildings with steel structures, or they're building new roads, or they're building railroads. It is those immigrant groups who would be the laborers accomplishing that strenuous activity. But because of their new status and their ability to be exploited, many people within the labor movement, the immigrants within the labor movement, did not want to be part of organized labor because they could easily be discriminated against. There was a fear of nativism. So nativism is the idea that the United States is meant for people who are born here and not for immigrants. But there's also this idea that there's a relation to Karl Marx, right? If you start fighting for the rights of laborers, it's sort of a small step from there to Marxism. And again, there's this sort of suspicion of immigrants. So the labor movement was vastly undercut because of fear and because of disease or unease by people who are working in these groups. Ultimately, though, there is the beginning of the labor movement. You have the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor, which are two groups that emerge trying to get better work conditions for the people within them, right? So the Knights of Labor were a group of people looking for assistance with people who are people of color and women, and they really worked on all forms of labor. The American Federation of Labor was really much more focused on skilled labor, artisans, and people who would work with their hands, and as you get trying to sort of differentiate different groups of people. So the feminist movement is also part of this progressive era reform. And in the progressive era reform for women's rights, we know that they ultimately succeed, so that in 1920, in the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, women do ultimately receive the right to vote. However, the struggle that happens is one that began in the early 19th century, the early 1800s, and really peaks with the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. And at that meeting, there is this discussion of at the meeting of Seneca Falls, right, that women should be given the right to vote and their political activism. Sometimes it's called maternal feminism. But then there's this, but then it sort of dies away for a lot of reasons. And then reemerges again in the progressive era in the late 19th century. And this time, women are taking a larger role in a lot of places, right? So you have the first beginnings of women's colleges emerging in the late 19th century. Women are taking larger roles in the settlement movement. So there's a huge push towards giving women the right to vote in the early 1900s because women are becoming far more present in a lot of these powerful places than they may have been, or at least there are more places for women to be doing this type of work. There are obviously oppositions to this. However, once World War I comes around and women take a larger role in winning World War I, there's less of an ability for people to stop them. And then this is certainly true when you have the beginnings of national organizations, right? So you have the National Women's Suffrage Association and another group, the American Women's Suffrage Association. These two groups were meant to, again, fight for women's rights, to political rights, the right to suffrage, the right to an equal education. And just like we talked about last week, sort of two conflicting goals, right? Sort of the short-term method versus the long-term method. The National Women's Association, Suffrage Association, sought to do larger, sweeping constitutional change, while the American Women's Suffrage Association wanted to take smaller action, state by state. Again, because the United States is a patchwork of sort of 50 different countries that can make up their own decisions on local elections, you could do this sort of state-by-state approach. So finally, when we get to the sort of presidents of the era, there is a huge, there is a big change here in the way that presidents approach their own power. The progressive presidents see the role of the federal government as different. For progressive presidents, it was the role of the federal government to get or to produce better situations for the people of the United States. So Theodore Roosevelt talks about what is called the square deal for the American people, What he means by the square deal is sort of an even opportunity for people, right? Not something that's going to be unfair, not something that's going to sort of treat people differently, but something where, you know, everybody's given an equal opportunity to sort of have access to sort of equality or money somehow, right? So what he does is he sets up the Interstate Commerce Act, which, or he allows to pass the Interstate Commerce Act, which regulates, as the name would suggest, trade between the states so that there can't be sort of price gouging. There's the Sherman Antitrust Act that begins to break up, those trusts, those sort of monopolies that govern, that sort of dominate the political industry. The one that's really interesting to me, at least, is a public health approach, right? So for a lot of people who were living in the early 1900s, your food would be produced in factories just like much of our food is today, but there was no regulation on what that food production might look like. There's no information on what that food might look like. So in 1906, a book is published called The Jungle by a Lithuanian immigrant, Upton Sinclair. And in it, he talks about the work conditions of the people who work in these meat packing plants. However, when you read the book, you also understand that this is a terrible place for your food to be produced. And there is discussion here about sort of people cutting their hands and people, sort of their skin is sort of falling off. There's a discussion of a gentleman falling into a vat of pork. And all these things sort of make people revolted at the idea of what they're eating. So again, we're starting to look at how people are living, and that encourages the Meat Inspection Act to be passed and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Again, no surprise that those two acts come right after that. Along with this, you also have conservation, right? Teddy Roosevelt, a huge fan of the outdoors, and if anybody here has ever been to Sagamore Hill, his home out in Long Island, you'll obviously, you'll know that he loved nature, at least hunting, right? Which hunting and conservation probably don't go hand in hand. But what you see is that he had a love for nature. And he begins to work with a guy named John Muir, M-U-I-R, a Scottish immigrant, who then they pass a couple of big laws are passed in terms of setting up national parks for the future. Again, Taft, the successor chosen by Roosevelt, continues a lot of these changes, right? Again, regulating telecommunications through the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, protecting labor, and again, looking at trying to make people's lives better. Finally, the last big one is Woodrow Wilson. Wilson is important because Wilson presides over three big amendments that really changed the government. The 16th Amendment establishes a graduated income tax. Basically, the first time that the United States government has had an income tax. The more money you earn, the more tax you will pay. And this is a big change because obviously it sort of says that if you have more money, from those who have more money, more is expected and more should be given. You also have the 17th Amendment, which is the direct election of senators. Before this, senators were chosen by the state governments in however a state chose. But now the states, the people in the states elect those senators. Again, making government more responsive to the people. And then obviously you have the 19th Amendment in 1920. For those of you keeping track, the 18th Amendment was prohibition. So when World War II comes to an end in 1919, there is a larger push for women's right to vote because women had been so integral in the defense of the country, the sort of the work that needed to be done while the war was being waged. So it was in many ways it was about time for women to get the right to vote, but it was the assistance during World War I that really pushed that over the edge. So the progressive era is an era where there's a huge amount of change that goes on. The government is becoming far more responsive and taking greater action for events that are going on and the mistreatment of people within the United States. It obviously doesn't make the United States a perfect place. We haven't really talked much about, because there were none, sort of race changes or laws protecting people who were of color. And if anything, this period saw an increase in lynchings, an increase in violence towards people of color. So this is not a perfect period, but there is a small step here in terms of making the country more responsive to the problems of the people.